The Arizona sun hammered down on Hannah's struggling homestead with the kind of merciless intensity that made every breath feel like inhaling fire. At 19 years old, she had spent the past 2 years alone after watching her parents slowly surrender to the brutal combination of drought, failed crops, and the crushing weight of unpayable debts. Her father had taken his own life in the barn one winter morning, unable to bear the shame of failure, and her mother had simply faded away 3 months later, grief and exhaustion claiming what little remained of her will to continue. Hannah had inherited nothing but dust, debts, and a determination born of having absolutely nowhere else to go. She was drawing water from her nearly dry well when she heard the sound, a low groan coming from inside the barn, followed by the unmistakable noise of something heavy collapsing against wood. Hannah's first instinct was fear. Desperate men sometimes used abandoned buildings for shelter, and a young woman alone was vulnerable to violence that frontier justice rarely bothered punishing. But curiosity and perhaps a reckless disregard for her own safety, what did she really have to lose, drove her to investigate. She grabbed the old rifle her father had left behind, though she had never been particularly skilled with firearms, and approached the barn cautiously. Inside the dim, stifling structure, she found him, a Navajo warrior slumped against a stack of rotting hay bales, his traditional clothing torn and soaked with blood from multiple wounds, his breathing shallow and labored. He looked to be about 30 years old, his weathered face drawn with pain but still carrying traces of strength and dignity despite his desperate condition. What struck Hannah most was his eyes when they met hers. They held not fear or pleading, but rather a fierce determination mixed with resignation, as if he had already accepted death but refused to surrender to it peacefully. Hannah stood frozen, rifle half raised, trying to process what she was seeing and what it meant for her already precarious situation. This was clearly a man running from something or someone, wounded badly enough that he had sought shelter in what he probably hoped was an abandoned building. Getting involved would bring trouble. The kind of trouble that could easily get her killed or worse in this lawless territory, where violence against natives was barely considered. Crime in helping them was viewed as betrayal. Every practical instinct screamed at her to leave immediately, perhaps even to ride for the nearest settlement and report his presence to authorities, who would handle the situation without involving her further. But Hannah found herself unable to move toward either flight or betrayal. She had spent 2 years completely alone, had watched her parents die without anyone offering help or even basic human compassion, had learned through bitter experience that the so-called civilized world cared nothing for those who fell behind or failed to thrive. Looking at this wounded warrior, she saw not an abstract enemy or threat, but simply another human being suffering without assistance, abandoned to die alone, just as her parents had been. The parallel struck her with unexpected force, and before she fully understood what she was doing, Hannah was lowering her rifle and moving forward to help rather than harm. She approached slowly, speaking in soft tones, though she had no idea if he understood English. The warrior watched her with wary intensity, clearly trying to determine whether she represented salvation or additional danger. When Hannah knelt beside him and began examining his wounds with gentle hands, he seemed to relax slightly, perhaps recognizing that she meant to help rather than finish what others had started. The injuries were severe: bullet wounds in his shoulder and side, numerous cuts and bruises suggesting he had been in a prolonged fight, and signs of infection beginning in the older wounds. Without proper treatment, he would certainly die within days, perhaps hours. Hannah worked quickly, drawing on the limited medical knowledge her mother had possessed and taught her during their years homesteading in this harsh land. She cleaned the wounds with precious water she could barely afford to use for such purposes, applied what little medicine remained in her meager supplies, and bandaged everything as best she could with torn strips from one of her few remaining good shirts. The warrior endured her ministrations without complaint, though she could see pain tightening his features with each touch. When she finished, she brought him water and what food she could spare, dried beans and stale bread that represented a significant portion of her remaining stores. As the warrior drank deeply and ate with obvious hunger, Hannah sat back and studied him more carefully. His clothing, despite being torn and bloodied, showed quality craftsmanship with intricate beadwork and silver ornaments that suggested he was someone of importance within his community. The weapons she found nearby, a rifle and a knife with distinctive engravings, appeared to be of good quality as well. This was not some random fugitive or desperate outcast. This was a man who had been something significant before whatever events had brought him wounded and alone to her barn. The warrior seemed to sense her assessment, and after he finished eating, he spoke in surprisingly clear English, his voice rough but comprehensible. He introduced himself as Hastian, which he explained meant man or mister in his language, and he told Hannah a story that made her blood run cold with anger and recognition of familiar injustice. He had been a respected member of his community, living peacefully with his wife and 2 young children on land his people had occupied for generations. 3 white traders had arrived, offering to purchase traditional crafts and sacred items, claiming to be honest businessmen interested in native culture. But the traders were actually thieves and worse, when Hastian's family would not sell certain sacred items that were not theirs to trade. The men had turned violent. They killed Hastian's wife and children in front of him, stole the sacred objects along with other valuables, and left him for dead after shooting him multiple times. He had survived through sheer will, had tracked the murderers across hundreds of miles of brutal desert, and had finally caught up with them at a settlement about 50 miles from Hannah's homestead. He had managed to wound one of them and recover some of what was stolen, but he had been shot again in the process and had barely escaped the inevitable pursuit that would follow. Hastian explained all this with controlled emotion, his pain evident not just from physical wounds, but from the deeper trauma of losing everything he loved to senseless cruelty and greed. He told Hannah he understood she had risked herself to help him, that he was grateful beyond words, but that she needed to know the danger his presence brought to her doorstep. The traders would be searching for him, would likely track him to this area eventually, and anyone found harboring him would face their violent retribution. He would leave as soon as he regained enough strength to travel, would take his troubles away from her so she would not suffer. Consequences for her compassion. Hannah listened to his story with growing fury at the injustice he described, fury that surprised her with its intensity, given her own emotional numbness over the past 2 years. Perhaps hearing about someone else's devastating loss awakened something in her that had been sleeping since her parents died, or perhaps she simply recognized that Hastian's tragedy was fundamentally the same as countless others she had witnessed or experienced. The powerful and cruel taking from those who could not defend themselves, leaving devastation and grief without facing any accountability. She made a decision in that moment that was either incredibly brave or suicidally foolish, and she would never be entirely sure which. She told Hastian that she would not just shelter him until he could travel, she would help him finish what he had started. The men who murdered his family deserved justice, and if the law would not provide it, then perhaps rougher justice was all that remained available. She knew where that settlement was, knew some of the people there, and might be able to gather information about the traders and their whereabouts that Hastian could not obtain alone given his obvious identity. Together, they might accomplish what neither could achieve separately, recovering the sacred items completely and ensuring the murderers faced consequences for their crimes. Hastian stared at Hannah with obvious shock, clearly not having expected this response from the young white woman who had already risked so much to help him. He tried to argue that she had no stake in his quest for vengeance, that she would be throwing away what little she had for strangers' conflicts, that the danger was real and deadly. But Hannah cut him off with simple, brutal honesty. She had nothing to throw away. No life worth preserving in its current form, no future that held anything but slow decay into poverty and irrelevance. Helping him gave her something she had not felt since her parents died, purpose beyond simple survival, a reason to care whether she lived or died, and the satisfaction of fighting against the kind of cruelty that had destroyed so many lives, including her own family's. Over the next 3 days, as Hastian slowly regained strength under Hannah's careful nursing, they began planning their approach to recovering the sacred items and delivering justice to the men who had murdered his family. Hastian explained what had been stolen, ceremonial objects that held deep spiritual significance for his people, items that connected them to ancestors and traditions going back centuries. The traders intended to sell these sacred artifacts to Eastern collectors, who paid premium prices for authentic Indian curiosities without caring about or understanding what they truly represented. Recovering them was about more than simple revenge. It was about preventing sacred heritage from being reduced to decorative objects in wealthy homes. Hannah rode into the settlement, a rough collection of buildings that served miners, ranchers, and various frontier opportunists under the pretense of seeking supplies and potential work. She was known there as the struggling orphan from the failing homestead, someone to be pitied or dismissed, but not particularly noticed or remembered. She spent time in the general store and the saloon, listening to conversations and asking carefully casual questions about recent events and new arrivals. Through patient information gathering, she learned that 3 traders had indeed arrived several days ago. That one was wounded and being treated by the settlement's doctor, and that they were boasting about valuable items they intended to transport east once the injured man could travel. The traders were staying at the settlement's only boarding house, a ramshackle 2-story building run by a widow who asked few questions as long as rent was paid. Hannah learned their names through overheard conversations: Jackson, Miller, and the wounded one called Sutton. She also learned they were not men who inspired trust or friendship, even among the morally flexible residents of this frontier settlement. They were crude, violent, and openly contemptuous of anyone they considered beneath them, which included virtually everyone they encountered. Several people mentioned being relieved when they eventually left, suggesting their presence created tension even in a place accustomed to rough characters. Hannah returned to her homestead with this intelligence, and she and Hastine spent the evening developing a strategy. They could not simply storm the boarding house and take what Hastine wanted. That would result in their immediate deaths or capture, and would likely end with the sacred items being destroyed or scattered. They needed to be smart, to use the traders' arrogance and their assumptions against them. Hastine's presence would need to remain completely secret until the critical moment, since seeing a Navajo warrior would immediately alert the traders to danger and cause them to take defensive measures that would make recovery impossible. Hannah would be their key advantage. She was known in the settlement, considered harmless and desperate, someone the traders would not view as any kind of threat. She could approach them with a proposal that would appeal to their greed while creating opportunity for Hastine to act. The plan was risky and required precise timing, but it represented their best chance of success given the limited resources and options available. Hastine acknowledged that he was essentially asking Hannah to act as bait, to put herself directly in danger, and he gave her multiple opportunities to withdraw from the plan without judgment. But Hannah remained committed, driven by anger at injustice and by the strange sense of purpose that had awakened in her since Hastine's arrival. The night before they would execute their plan, Hannah and Hastine sat outside her cabin, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. They spoke about their lives before tragedy had brought them to this point. Hastine described his wife's laugh, his children's curiosity about everything, the peaceful life they had been building before violence shattered it all. Hannah talked about her parents, about her father's descent into despair, about her mother's quiet acceptance of death, about the 2 years she had spent alone, wondering if survival was worth the effort it required. The conversation created unexpected intimacy, 2 wounded people recognizing their shared experience of loss and finding comfort in not being entirely alone with their grief and anger. As dawn approached on the day they would act, Hannah felt strangely calm despite the danger ahead. She dressed carefully in her most presentable clothing, still worn and faded, but clean and appropriate for someone seeking employment or trade opportunities. She practiced her story multiple times with Hastine listening and offering suggestions about how to make her desperation more believable, how to appeal to the traders' arrogance and greed. Finally, as the sun climbed higher and heat began building toward the day's oppressive peak, Hannah rode toward the settlement while Hastine remained hidden. Preparing to move into position once Hannah had created the opening their plan required, Hannah found the 3 traders in the saloon, already drinking despite the early hour. Jackson was the obvious leader, a heavy-set man with cruel eyes and a casual way of speaking about violence that made Hannah's skin crawl. Miller was thinner and nervous, constantly looking around as if expecting trouble. Sutton, the wounded one, sat awkwardly favoring his injured side, his face pale but his expression mean. Hannah approached their table with calculated timidity, introducing herself and explaining that she had heard they were traders interested in native artifacts, and that she knew of a location where such items might be found if they were interested in making it worth her while to share that information. The traders looked at her with a mixture of contempt and interest, clearly viewing her as another desperate frontier failure, willing to sell out for a few dollars. Jackson questioned her roughly about what she knew and how she had learned it, and Hannah delivered the story she and Hastine had carefully constructed. She claimed a Navajo man had stayed briefly at her homestead while traveling, had left items behind, and she needed money badly enough to betray his trust by revealing this to potential buyers. The story was designed to appeal to the traders' assumptions about desperate settlers and their willingness to exploit natives for any advantage. Jackson decided to investigate her claim, but with suspicious caution, he told Hannah she would guide them to her homestead immediately, and that if she was lying or leading them into any kind of trap, she would regret it severely before they killed her. The threat was delivered casually, making clear these were men who had committed violence before, and would do so again without hesitation. Hannah maintained her frightened, submissive demeanor, while internally her mind raced through the next steps of the plan. She led them on horseback toward her property, the three traders armed and alert, clearly prepared for trouble, even as they anticipated easy profit. As they approached Hannah's homestead in the afternoon heat, she led them not to her cabin, but toward an old storage shed she claimed contained the items. The structure was partially collapsed, barely standing, the kind of place that looked like it might hold forgotten possessions. Hannah explained nervously that she had not examined everything carefully, that she had been too frightened to thoroughly investigate what the Navajo traveler had left behind. Jackson dismounted along with Miller, telling Sutton to watch the girl while they checked the shed. This was exactly what Hannah and Hastine had anticipated. The wounded man would be separated from his companions and less able to fight effectively. Hannah had positioned herself near Sutton, appearing nervous and submissive, when Hastine emerged from concealment behind the wounded trader. The Navajo warrior moved with remarkable speed despite his own injuries, disarming and subduing Sutton before the man could even cry out warning. At the same moment, Hannah drew the pistol she had hidden in her clothing and pointed it at Jackson and Miller as they turned in shock at the commotion. Her hands shook, but her voice remained steady as she ordered them to drop their weapons, to make no sudden movements, to understand that they were now prisoners of the man whose family they had murdered. Jackson's face transformed from shock to rage as he recognized Hastine, clearly not having expected the dead Navajo to be alive and seeking vengeance. He started to reach for his weapon despite Hannah's command, and she fired, not to kill but to demonstrate she was serious, the bullet kicking up dust near his feet. The shot accomplished its purpose. Jackson froze and slowly raised his hands, his expression showing calculation about whether he could turn this situation to his advantage. Miller had already surrendered, his nervous nature making him quicker to recognize when resistance was futile. Hastine moved forward and systematically disarmed both men, his movements controlled, but his eyes burning with barely contained fury. He spoke to them in cold, precise English, telling them exactly who he was, describing his murdered wife and children, explaining that they would now face justice for crimes they had assumed would go unpunished. Jackson tried blustering, claiming they had acted in self-defense, that the attack on Hastine's family had been justified by some imagined provocation. But Hastine cut him off sharply, his voice carrying lethal promise. They would return everything they had stolen. They would face consequences for their murders. And they would learn that some debts could not be escaped simply by assuming their victims were powerless. With the three traders secured and disarmed, Hastine and Hannah forced them to reveal where they had hidden the stolen sacred items. Jackson initially refused, trying to negotiate for his life, but Hastine made clear through quiet intensity that cooperation was the only option that might allow them to survive this encounter. Eventually, Jackson directed them to saddlebags on their horses, containing most of the stolen artifacts, ceremonial objects wrapped carelessly in cloth, treated as mere commodities rather than sacred items deserving reverence and respect. Hastian's hands trembled as he unwrapped each piece, his expression mixing relief at recovering them with renewed grief at remembering the circumstances of their theft. Hannah watched as Hastian examined the artifacts, seeing in his careful handling how much these objects meant beyond any monetary value. These were connections to ancestors and traditions, items used in ceremonies that bound communities together and linked present to past. The traders had viewed them as exotic curiosities to be sold to wealthy collectors, completely unable to comprehend that they were stealing not just objects, but pieces of cultural identity and spiritual practice. The disconnect between these two understandings, the traders' crude materialism versus Hastian's spiritual reverence, crystallized. For Hannah, the fundamental conflict between the worlds colliding across the frontier, the question of what to do with the three traders now that they were captured and disarmed, created immediate tension. Hastian clearly wanted them dead, wanted to deliver the same violence they had inflicted on his defenseless family. Hannah understood that desire completely. It would be simple justice, and no law would punish them for executing murderers who operated beyond legal reach. Yet she also recognized that killing them in cold blood would change something fundamental about who she and Hastian were, would cross a line that could not be uncrossed. They debated intensely, Hastian arguing that letting them live meant they would simply continue harming others, Hannah countering that there might be a middle path between execution and release eventually. They reached a compromise that satisfied neither completely, but that both could accept. They would take the traders to the nearest military outpost and turn them over to authorities with a full accounting of their crimes, the murders, the theft of sacred items, and their attempted ambush when Hastian sought recovery. This approach would not guarantee justice. Military authorities often showed little interest in crimes against natives, and the traders might simply be released or given token punishment. But it would at least create an official record, would make their crimes known, and would offer a slim possibility that genuine accountability might follow. More importantly for Hastian, it would allow him to reclaim his sacred items and return to his people without becoming the kind of person his wife and children would not have recognized. The journey to the military outpost took 2 days, during which the bound traders alternated between sullen silence and threats about what would happen when they were freed. Hannah and Hastian took turns keeping watch, neither trusting the prisoners enough to sleep simultaneously. During the quiet evening hours, they continued the conversations that had begun during the planning phase, sharing more about their lives and their perspectives. Hannah found herself fascinated by Hastian's descriptions of Navajo culture and values, recognizing that everything she had been taught about native peoples had been filtered through prejudice and ignorance, designed to justify their displacement and destruction. Hastian, for his part, seemed surprised by Hannah's willingness to question her own society's assumptions, to recognize that the frontier violence and theft were not justified by some inherent superiority, but rather represented simple greed and cruelty dressed up in more palatable language. Their mutual recognition that the other possessed intelligence, integrity, and depth beyond cultural stereotypes created a bond that transcended the practical alliance of their revenge mission. They were becoming genuine friends, perhaps the first either had known since. Their respective tragedies had isolated them from normal human connection. When they arrived at the military outpost and presented their prisoners along with evidence of the murders and theft, the receiving officer's reaction confirmed Hannah's cynicism about official justice. He listened with obvious skepticism, clearly viewing the whole situation as troublesome complication he would prefer to avoid. The traders immediately launched into claims that they had been ambushed and robbed by a savage Indian and his white accomplice, that any items recovered were rightfully theirs through legitimate trade, and that they were the actual victims deserving protection. The officer seemed inclined to believe their version simply because it aligned with his prejudices and made his job easier. Hannah felt rage building as she watched the officer dismiss Hastian's testimony and evidence, treating the murdered family as irrelevant footnotes to what he clearly viewed as a property dispute at most. She interrupted with cold fury, pointing out that the officer's willingness to ignore murders of native people in favor of protecting white criminals said everything about the corruption and moral bankruptcy of the supposed civilization he represented. Her tirade probably accomplished nothing in terms of official action, but it felt necessary to speak truth, even when truth held no power to change outcomes. Ultimately, the officer agreed to hold the traders for investigation, but made clear his skepticism about any serious charges being pursued. Hastien and Hannah left the outpost, knowing they had accomplished only partial victory. The sacred items were recovered and could be returned to Hastien's people, but the murderers would likely face minimal consequences and would probably continue their predatory activities once released. It was unsatisfying, but perhaps the best outcome available in a system designed to favor certain people, while dismissing others as less than fully human. As they rode away from the outpost, Hastien spoke seriously to Hannah about what would happen next. He needed to return to his people, needed to bring back the sacred items, and to begin the long process of mourning his family properly according to traditional practices. But he wanted Hannah to understand that she had earned more than his personal gratitude. She had demonstrated courage and honor that his people would recognize and value, and he intended to tell them everything about what she had done. He could not promise what that would mean for her future, but he wanted her to know that she would not be forgotten, that her actions had created bonds that extended beyond their immediate partnership. Hannah accepted his words with mixed emotions. She had helped Hastien because it felt right, because she needed purpose beyond her own survival, and because fighting against injustice satisfied something deep in her soul. She had not expected or sought reward beyond the satisfaction of accomplishment. But she also recognized that returning to her isolated homestead after this experience would be difficult. She had tasted purpose and partnership, had felt alive in ways she had not since her parents died, and going back to solitary existence would feel like a kind of death. Still, she had no realistic alternatives and no right to expect anything more from Hastien or his people beyond the thanks he had already expressed. They parted at a crossroads where their paths diverged. Hastien heading toward Navajo territories and Hannah returning to her struggling homestead. The goodbye was more emotional than either had expected, reflecting how much they had come to mean to each other during the intense days of planning and executing their mission. Hastien placed his hand over his heart in a gesture Hannah had come to recognize as conveying deep respect and gratitude, and she returned it awkwardly but sincerely. Then he rode away toward his people and his grief, while she turned toward her empty cabin and her uncertain future, both of them changed by experiences that had forced them to cross boundaries and question assumptions they had carried without examination. Hannah returned to her homestead to find it exactly as she had left it, dusty, deteriorating and utterly isolated from anything resembling community or purpose. The days following her separation from Hastien felt hollow in ways that surprised her with their intensity. She had known she would miss his presence, but she had not anticipated how profoundly the loss of purpose would affect her. She went through the motions of maintaining her property, but the work felt pointless when she knew the homestead was slowly failing regardless of her efforts. She had tasted meaning during her days helping Hastien, and returning to meaningless survival felt like suffocating slowly in familiar misery. 5 days after Hastien's departure, as Hannah was attempting to repair yet another section of her failing fence, she heard the sound that would change everything. Horses approaching in large numbers, the thunder of many hooves creating vibrations she could feel through the ground. Her first thought was bandits or raiders, and she grabbed her rifle while moving toward her cabin to take defensive position. But as the riders came into view, cresting the hill overlooking her property, Hannah realized with shock that this was no random threat. This was a massive group of Navajo warriors, easily 300 riders, moving toward her homestead with purposeful intent. Hannah stood frozen on her porch, rifle forgotten in her hands, as the enormous group approached and gradually surrounded her property in a formation that was clearly ceremonial rather than hostile. The riders were dressed formally, many wearing traditional clothing with silver jewelry, and carrying weapons but not in aggressive postures. At the center of the formation, several riders approached more closely, and Hannah recognized Hastien among them, now accompanied by older men who carried themselves with obvious authority. The sheer scale and formality of what was happening overwhelmed her completely. This was not casual visit, but rather something significant within Navajo cultural practice, though she had no framework for understanding. what exactly it meant, Hastian dismounted along with the elder riders and approached Hannah's porch with solemnity that made her heart race with anxiety about what was coming. When he spoke, his English was formal and careful, clearly conveying important information that needed to be understood precisely. He explained that he had returned to his people and had told them everything about Hannah, how she had risked her life to help him, how she had aided his quest to recover sacred items and seek justice for his murdered family, how she had demonstrated courage and honor that transcended the usual divisions between their peoples. The tribal elders had discussed her actions extensively and had made decisions about how to properly acknowledge what she had done. The oldest of the elder riders, a man whose weathered face carried the marks of a long and difficult life, spoke through Hastian's translation. He stated that Hannah had demonstrated the kind of character and courage that Navajo people valued, above almost any other qualities. She had helped one of their warriors when doing so, brought her no benefit and considerable danger. She had fought against injustice, even though the victims were strangers whose fate should have meant nothing to her, according to her society's values. Such actions created obligations that the tribe took very seriously, obligations that could not be discharged through simple thanks or token gifts. The elder continued, explaining that after extensive discussion, the tribal council had made an unprecedented decision. They were offering Hannah adoption into their people, full membership in the community, with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. She would be given a new name in their language, would be assigned to a clan that would become her family, and would receive their protection and support for as long as she lived. The offer was extraordinary, the elder emphasized, never before extended to someone from the white world, and it reflected both the debt they owed her and their recognition that she possessed the qualities that defined true character, regardless of birth or background. Hannah listened in stunned silence, unable to immediately process what she was hearing. They wanted to adopt her, to make her one of them. The idea was so far outside anything she had imagined possible that she initially thought she must be misunderstanding through translation difficulties. But Hastian's solemn expression and careful repetition of the key points made clear this was exactly what it sounded like. 300 Navajo warriors had ridden to her door, not to threaten or demand, but to offer her a place among their people, to honor her in the most profound way their culture could express. The elder also explained an alternative option, demonstrating that this was genuine choice rather than coercion disguised as honor. If Hannah preferred to remain in the white world, she would receive their protection and support in different form. They would ensure her homestead received the assistance needed to become genuinely productive, would trade with her regularly to make her business sustainable, and would make known throughout the territory that she was under Navajo safeguard, which would prevent most threats or exploitation. She could rebuild the life her parents had tried to create, this time with resources and protection that would actually give it chance of success. Hannah's mind raced through the impossible choice before her. Staying meant clinging to a life that had brought her nothing but loss and isolation, maintaining her parents' dying dream out of obligation rather than genuine hope. The Navajo offer of support would make survival easier, but it would not address the fundamental loneliness and purposelessness that had defined her existence since her parents died. Joining them meant abandoning everything familiar, learning completely new ways of living, and accepting that she would be permanently separated from her birth culture. It terrified her, yet it also represented exactly what she had been craving without fully recognizing it. Community, purpose, belonging, and the sense that her life meant something beyond mere survival. She looked at Hastian, searching his face for guidance about what he wanted her to choose. But his expression remained neutral, making clear this had to be her decision made freely, rather than influenced by his preferences or expectations. The elder spoke again, stating that she should take time to consider carefully, that such momentous choices could not be made hastily under pressure. They would camp nearby for 3 days, giving her space to think and decide, without the overwhelming presence of 300 warriors surrounding her home. Whatever she chose would be respected and honored, and they would fulfill their obligations according to her decision. As the massive group withdrew to establish their camp at respectful distance, Hannah sat heavily on her porch steps, feeling utterly overwhelmed by the day's events. She had helped one wounded warrior out of simple compassion and a desire for purpose beyond her own struggling survival. That single choice had led to days of dangerous pursuit of justice, to genuine friendship with someone from a world completely different from her own, and now to an offer so extraordinary, she still struggled to believe it was real rather than elaborate fantasy. 300 horsemen had surrounded her homestead, not to destroy but to honor her, to offer her a future she could never have imagined. Hannah spent 3 days in intense contemplation, walking her property and thinking about every aspect of the choice before her. She examined her cabin room by room, remembering her parents and the hopes they had carried when building this homestead. She sat in the places where her father had taught her to read, where her mother had shown her how to prepare medicines from desert plants, where they had shared meals as a family before illness and despair had torn everything apart. She felt the weight of their legacy pressing on her, the sense that abandoning their dream meant betraying their memory. But as she sat in those spaces and remembered those times, Hannah gradually recognized something important. Her parents had built this homestead seeking better life than what they had known, seeking opportunity and fresh start in harsh but open territory. They had chosen transformation, had left behind everything familiar to pursue possibilities that excited and frightened them. If they were here now, would they want her to cling stubbornly to their specific vision even as it crumbled? Or would they encourage her to do what they had done? Recognize when circumstances demanded letting go of the past and embracing uncertain but promising future. She thought about Hastin and the days they had spent together planning and executing their mission. She had felt more alive, more purposeful, more genuinely herself during that time than during the 2 years of isolated survival following her parents' deaths. She had discovered capabilities she did not know she possessed: courage to face danger, strategic thinking under pressure, willingness to fight for justice even when it brought no personal benefit. Those discoveries suggested that her true self was not the resigned, slowly dying woman who had been maintaining this homestead out of lack of alternatives, but rather someone who thrived when challenged and valued, someone who needed purpose beyond mere existence. She also considered practically what each choice would mean for her future. Staying with Navajo support would make survival easier, but it would not address the fundamental isolation and purposelessness that had defined her recent life. She would still be alone, still separate from genuine community, still marking time rather than truly living. The homestead might prosper materially with tribal assistance, but Hannah recognized that material security was not what she truly needed or wanted. She needed belonging, needed to be part of something larger than herself, needed to contribute to collective purpose rather than simply maintaining individual survival. Joining the Navajo band meant learning new language, new customs, new ways of understanding the world. It meant accepting that she would be perpetually somewhat different, that her white heritage would always mark her as someone who had crossed boundaries rather than someone who belonged by birth. But it also meant community, purpose, and the kind of meaning that came from being valued for character and actions, rather than judged by circumstances of birth or failure. It meant living rather than simply existing, growing rather than slowly decaying, becoming rather than remaining static. On the morning of the 3rd day, Hannah made her decision with clarity that surprised her given how conflicted she had felt initially. She would accept the Navajo offer of adoption, would join Hastian's people, would learn their ways and try to become worthy of the extraordinary honor they were extending. She packed carefully, selecting her mother's Bible, her father's watch, a photograph of her parents, and practical items she might need, while leaving behind furniture and possessions that represented the life she was choosing to release. She also wrote a letter to be left at the Territorial Land Office, formally relinquishing her property claims, so no one could later accuse her of maintaining stake in white settlements while living among native peoples. When she walked to the Navajo camp to announce her decision, Hastian greeted her with a smile that suggested he had hoped for, but not presumed this outcome. The tribal elders received her choice with solemn approval, and preparations began immediately for ceremonies that would formalize her adoption. Over the following days, Hannah participated in rituals she did not fully understand, but which clearly carried deep significance for the community accepting her. She was given a Navajo name, Azza Sani, meaning wise woman, reflecting the elders' judgment that her actions had demonstrated wisdom beyond her years. She was assigned to a clan headed by an older woman named Dedi, who would serve as her adoptive mother, teaching her the knowledge and skills necessary for contributing to communal life. Dedi approached her role with patience and warmth, recognizing that Hannah's transition would be difficult and would require guidance that balanced instruction with acceptance of inevitable mistakes. Under Dedi's mentorship, Hannah began learning the Navajo language in earnest, practiced traditional crafts and food preparation methods, and started understanding the complex social structures and spiritual beliefs that organize the community's existence. Hastian remained a constant presence during her transition, serving as translator when language barriers became too frustrating, and as friend when the overwhelming nature of her transformation threatened to break her resolve. Their relationship deepened from the partnership forged during their quest for justice into something more complex. Mutual respect, genuine affection, and a recognition that their shared experiences had created bonds that would endure regardless of what form their relationship ultimately took. Others in the band noticed their connection, and quiet speculation arose about whether it might develop into something more formal. Though both Hastian and Hannah were focused primarily on navigating the immediate challenges of her integration, the first months were extraordinarily difficult. Hannah made countless mistakes in language, customs, and social interactions. Some community members remained skeptical about accepting a white woman, viewing her presence as dangerous precedent that could invite unwanted attention from military authorities or create complications with other tribes. But gradually, through consistent effort and demonstrated willingness to learn rather than expecting accommodation, Hannah began earning acceptance that went beyond the formal adoption ceremony. She proved capable at tasks assigned to her, showed respect for traditions she was learning, and never complained about the hardships inherent in Mobile Sut, lifestyle completely different from settled. Homesteading she had known, one significant test of her integration came about 6 months after her adoption, when the band faced decision about how to respond to increasing pressure from military forces seeking to relocate all Navajo peoples to designated reservation lands. The debate within the community was intense. Some argued for compliance to avoid violent conflict. Others insisted on maintaining traditional independence, even if it meant continued confrontation with overwhelming force. Hannah was included in these discussions despite her newcomer status, and her perspective as someone who understood both white and Navajo thinking proved valuable in helping the band assess their realistic options. Hannah spoke honestly about what she knew of military thinking and governmental policies, explaining that the push toward reservation confinement was systematic rather than temporary, that resistance would be met with escalating force, and that independent bands would face increasing difficulty maintaining traditional lifestyles as settler expansion continued. Her assessment was sobering, but helped the community make informed decisions about strategies for preserving as much autonomy and cultural integrity as possible while acknowledging harsh realities they faced. The elders appreciated her willingness to share difficult truths rather than telling them what she thought they wanted to hear. The Navajo language in earnest, practiced traditional crafts and food preparation methods, and started understanding the complex social structures and spiritual beliefs that organized the community's existence. Hastian remained a constant presence during her transition, serving as translator when language barriers became too frustrating, and as friend when the overwhelming nature of her transformation threatened to break her resolve. Their relationship deepened from the partnership forged during their quest for justice into something more complex: mutual respect, genuine affection, and a recognition that their shared experiences had created bonds that would endure regardless of what form their relationship ultimately took. Others in the band noticed their connection, and quiet speculation arose about whether it might develop into something more formal, though both Hastian and Hannah were focused primarily on navigating the immediate challenges of her integration. The first months were extraordinarily difficult. Hannah made countless mistakes in language, customs, and social interactions. Some community members remained skeptical about accepting a white woman, viewing her presence as dangerous precedent that could invite unwanted attention from military authorities or create complications with other tribes. But gradually, through consistent effort and demonstrated willingness to learn rather than expecting accommodation, Hannah began earning acceptance that went beyond the formal adoption ceremony. She proved capable at tasks assigned to her, showed respect for traditions she was learning, and never complained about the hardships inherent in mobile, lifestyle completely different from settled, homesteading she had known. One significant test of her integration came about 6 months after her adoption, when the band faced decision about how to respond to increasing pressure from military forces, seeking to relocate all Navajo peoples to designated reservation lands. The debate within the community was intense. Some argued for compliance to avoid violent conflict. Others insisted on maintaining traditional independence, even if it meant continued confrontation with overwhelming force. Hannah was included in these discussions despite her newcomer status, and her perspective as someone who understood both white and Navajo thinking proved valuable in helping the band assess their realistic options. Hannah spoke honestly about what she knew of military thinking and governmental policies, explaining that the push toward reservation confinement was systematic rather than temporary, that resistance would be met with escalating force, and that independent bands would face increasing difficulty maintaining traditional lifestyles as settler expansion continued. Her assessment was sobering, but helped the community make informed decisions about strategies for preserving as much autonomy and cultural integrity as possible while acknowledging harsh realities they faced. The elders appreciated her willingness to share difficult truths rather than telling them what she thought they wanted to hear. As seasons passed and Hannah's first year with the Navajo band approached completion, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. She had been a desperate, isolated orphan, slowly dying in a failing homestead, when she discovered a wounded warrior in her barn. She had chosen to help him not expecting reward, but simply because compassion demanded action. That choice had led to dangerous mission seeking justice for murdered family, to genuine friendship across cultural divides, and ultimately to 300 horsemen arriving at her door offering her a future she could never have imagined. The transformation she had undergone was profound and permanent. She no longer thought of herself primarily as white woman living among Navajos, but rather as Astzar Sani, member of Dedi's clan, part of a community that valued her contributions and accepted her presence. She still carried her parents' memory and honored the values they had taught her, but she had learned to see those values as universal rather than specific to one culture. Courage, compassion, justice, and community mattered regardless of language spoken or traditions followed, and Hannah had discovered that living according to those principles was possible in multiple cultural contexts. Her relationship with Hastine had also evolved in ways that felt natural and right despite the unusual circumstances of their meeting. About 8 months after her adoption, Hastine formally approached Dedi to request permission to court Hannah, according to Navajo customs. The courtship process was different from what Hannah had known in white society, more communal, more focused on demonstrating capability as provider and partner, more integrated into daily life, rather than separated as special social activity. But the essential elements were familiar. Two people learning each other's characters, assessing compatibility, building toward potential future together. When Hastine and Hannah finally married in a ceremony that honored both Navajo traditions and acknowledged her unique background, the celebration reflected how fully the community had come to accept her presence. The skeptics who had initially questioned bringing a white woman into the band now celebrated alongside those who had welcomed her from the beginning. Hannah Azasani had proven through consistent action and character that she belonged. That adoption was not just formal category, but genuine transformation of identity and belonging. As the ceremony concluded and the community celebrated around them, Hannah thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment. She had helped a captive warrior take revenge against men who murdered his family, motivated by nothing more than belief that justice mattered and that suffering should not be ignored when she could act to prevent or address it. Days later, 300 horsemen had surrounded her homestead, not to punish her involvement in violence, but to honor her courage and offer her place among their people. She had accepted that offer and had discovered in doing so that home was not a location or a building, but rather a sense of belonging built through shared values and mutual commitment. She had lost her parents and their dream, had spent years believing she had nothing worth living for beyond stubborn survival. But by choosing to help one wounded warrior, she had found purpose, community, and ultimately love that had transformed her from isolated orphan into valued member of a people who measured worth by character rather than birth. The Arizona night settled peaceful and vast over the Navajo camp, stars wheeling overhead in patterns that had guided countless generations across these harsh but beautiful lands. Hannah Azzarsani stood beside her husband, surrounded by her adopted family, secure in belonging she had earned through choices made when compassion and justice demanded action regardless of personal cost. She had helped a captive warrior take revenge, and 300 horsemen had come to her door. They had given her something far more valuable than protection or material support. They had given her a home, a purpose, and a future worth living. The young woman who had been slowly dying alone in a failing homestead was gone, transformed into someone who had found strength, community, and meaning she never would have discovered without crossing boundaries that separated peoples and cultures. Her story would be told and remembered, the white woman who helped the warrior, who chose justice over safety, who accepted adoption into a people not her own by birth, but who became hers through choice and mutual recognition of shared values. She had freed herself from a dying past by choosing to embrace an uncertain but living future, and in doing so had discovered that sometimes the most important journeys began with a single act of courage performed when everything seemed lost and nothing seemed to matter. The future remained uncertain, reservation, confinement loomed as increasingly inevitable reality, and the traditional ways of life she had adopted would face continued pressure from forces neither she nor her new people could fully control. But Hannah faced that uncertain future not alone, but surrounded by community, not without purpose but committed to preserving what was most essential about the culture and values she had learned to honor. She had been an orphan girl who helped a captive warrior take revenge, and days later, riders had claimed her as one of them. That claiming had saved her life in ways that extended far beyond physical survival, had given her reason to care whether she lived or died, and had taught her that belonging was built not through birth but through character, courage, and the willingness to act according to conscience, even when doing so demanded everything.